when you talk about domestic intelligence operations, you have to place it into the context of who is conducting the operation. At this point, we've identified 65 separate federal agencies that engage in some sort of intelligence collection and intelligence storage and analysis. Ranges from the Department of the Agriculture, which has the third largest investigative intelligence force in the federal government, down through the bureaucracy of HEW, Housing and Urban Development, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Central Intelligence Agency, the Department of Treasury, and just on and on and on. We could list them for an hour and talk about what each and every one of them does and still not even scratch the surface. I think the agencies that people are most concerned with are the FBI and the CIA at this point. And I think that concern is justified, although I would really stress that people should place it in the context of there being a massive network of federal agencies capable of conducting infiltration and spying activities. With the FBI, I think that the major program people have not heard enough about is the FBI counterintelligence program. The counterintelligence program was officially begun in '54 against the Communist Party of the United States. It was designed to neutralize the effectiveness of the Communist Party in its political efforts. It involved disinformation, the preparation of what the intelligence community considers to be black propaganda, false propaganda, and circulating of rumors and innuendo, and trying to make the most out of internal, legitimate political differences between factions and individuals. In some cases, it might have even gone further into burglary and theft of mail and other such notorious deeds. But it grew within the Communist Party to such a point that by 1960, 1 out of every 5.6 members of the Communist Party in the United States was actually an FBI informant. This program was expanded in '61 to include the Socialist Workers' Party. Their lawsuit against the CIA and the FBI has brought out a wealth of material on how the federal government has deliberately and maliciously targeted a legitimate political party for interference. Party members have been harassed, they've lost their jobs, they've been subjected to campaigns of lies and innuendo. There's been unexplained burglaries, unexplained bombings, all forms of harassment that you can see existing within a pattern when you compare it to what has happened to members of the Communist Party. In '67, I believe it was, yes, early '67, J. Edgar Hoover extended his paranoia away from communists and into black nationalists. And he extended the counterintelligence program, or COINTELPRO as it's known in bureau talk, to include black nationalist organizations in general. And as the documents we've seen so far tend to show, it went from just general fear of black groups in general to specific fear of the Black Panther Party. Again, a very specialized program of disruption taking place that tried to circulate false stories about party leaders, tried to create the impression that trusted party officials were actually FBI informers when in fact they weren't. Their activities were so widespread against the Panthers, and the disruption of the Panther Party was so great that there is real legitimate concern that the truth behind the death of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark is not totally known. Fred Hampton was killed on December 4th, 1969 in a police raid led by representatives of the Illinois Attorney General's office, and the Attorney General himself, I believe, or Deputy Attorney General, took part in that raid. And when the shooting was all over, there was hundreds of bullet holes in the Panther headquarters, which was actually an apartment, and only one of those bullets could have possibly have come from a Panther gun. Further investigation showed that the man who was the bodyguard for Fred Hampton, who was at that time chairman of the Illinois chapter, was a man named Roy O'Neill, and Mr. O'Neill was on the FBI payroll as an informant. Blood samples of Fred Hampton's blood show that there was a high concentration of barbiturates, leading many people to believe that Fred Hampton was drugged in order to facilitate the raid, and the raid was conducted at the instigation of the FBI through its inside man, Roy O'Neill. This has led to a multi-million-dollar wrongful death suit filed by Fred Hampton's survivors against the FBI, the CIA, and elements of the Chicago and state of Illinois authorities. So we have the FBI engaging all this massive interference, and it's carried on over into the New Left. The anti-war movement was especially prone towards counterintelligence operations. One operation that was partially successful was an attempt to blackmail the New MOB, the New Mobilization Committee, to end the war in Vietnam shortly before the massive 1969 November moratorium, where an informer inside a black organization in Washington convinced the black leadership that they should demand a bond of the white peace organizations, and the bond sum was, was close to $500,000 or something, and that unless that bond was posted by the peace groups, the blacks would not guarantee, that the demonstration could take place. They would not physically oppose it as in attacking it, but that they would politically oppose the demonstration on the grounds of its potential for disrupting the black community in Washington. And this is the kind of interplay that went on with FBI informants trying to play on people's fears, people's legitimate concerns and legitimate differences, and turning them into a counterproductive force that saw people within the left pitting more time and energy against one another than against their common enemy. This program was terminated officially in 1971 after a group of Catholic pacifists broke into a field office in Media, Pennsylvania, and liberated a bunch of documents during the dark of night. Those documents later became known as the Media Papers. And some of those Media Papers are labeled COINTELPRO. And this was the first indication of any coordinated, concentrated counterintelligence effort on the part of the FBI. From those Media Papers, Freedom of Information requests were initiated that led to the disclosures that we now have on COINTELPRO. The CIA is a different bag of worms altogether. For years and years, people on the left were saying the CIA is interfering with our right to exist and our right to organize. They're destroying our movement. They're trying to destroy our energies and whatnot. And liberals especially were very prone to saying, well, the CIA can't be doing that because the CIA is only a foreign intelligence operation. We know that they're not involved in anything with domestic politics because that would be a violation of the law. Well, last December we saw that the liberals were wrong when Cy Hirsch broke his story in the New York Times that said that over 10,000 American political activists had files maintained on them in the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. And when the truth came out, it was actually something like 13,000 files that were compiled by the CIA on American citizens and organizations, and another 300,000 people had their name in a computer index that was contained within the Office of Security, which is the CIA office charged with maintaining physical security on CIA facilities. The CIA, in the course of the Rockefeller Commission investigation, was found to have two concentrated programs designed to infiltrate radical organizations or affect the course of radical organization in the United States. One of those was called Operation Chaos, and Chaos was the process of introducing CIA agents into radical organizations for the purpose of what they call sheep dipping. That is, to give them enough contact with the left that they could pick up the jargon, the lifestyles, the mannerisms, the political philosophy and whatnot, and then to take these sheep dip agents and send them overseas where they would operate within the political communities of especially West European countries, keeping an eye, for example, on the student movement in France after their partially successful alliance with workers in 1968 and all the possibility of revolution in France in that period. There was an admitted 28 agents recruited for sheep dipping. But the actual number that went into service overseas is unknown. The second part of this whole thing was an analytical thing where the CIA was collecting intelligence on domestic organizations and then producing an analysis of their potential. One such study was called The Restless Youth. This was an overall analysis of student movement throughout the world, including the United States, giving its potential for strength, giving its concepts, its ideologies, and whatnot. Through Operation Chaos, however, even though agents were supposedly only being sheep-dipped and were only collecting information for analytical purposes, these people were involved in the political process. They were involved in infiltrating organizations and, in some cases, perhaps even being in leadership positions within those organizations. The second program, aside from Chaos, and Chaos having two parts to it, so this is actually a third CIA program we're talking about, was conducted within the Office of Security. And it was allegedly a short-lived program. I think that in reality it was. That started, I believe, in early '67, where the CIA claims it was concerned over the safety of recruiters who were visiting campuses and being confronted by anti-war activists. And they initiated a program of liaison with local police departments that had the effect of taking local police informants and utilizing their resources for the benefit of the CIA. In Washington, D.C., the concern was so great because of the demonstrations that were taking place here that CIA personnel, contract agents, primarily they claim out-of-work construction workers and housewives, were used to infiltrate a number of organizations such as Women's Strike for Peace, the Washington, D.C. Peace Center, the Mobilization, anyone that was involved in any facet of planning demonstrations in Washington. Any organization that was involved in that was a target for an Office of Security agent being placed in their midst. It wasn't just anti-war organizations. It was also black organizations in Washington, such as the Nation of Islam, a group called Niggers Incorporated, the Afro-American School of Thought, both academic institutions and activist organizations. If they reflected any sort of trend that the CIA felt would give them insights into how the black community was thinking, whammo, they were a target. This operation continued for about 18 months, this infiltration of Washington, D.C. area organizations, and was finally terminated when the D.C. Police Department assumed the responsibility for it. There was from what we can see, some sort of a quid pro quo arrangement with between the D.C. police and the CIA that over the years involved the lending of CIA equipment to the D.C. police, the training of both, a two-way training thing, CIA agents being trained by D.C. police and D.C. police being trained by CIA agents. This sort of training exercise was not restricted to D.C. There were police trained from at least 12 other communities throughout the country, 12 major cities from throughout the country, including Chicago and New York, and Fairfax County, Virginia. Those are three that we know of besides Washington. Being trained by the CIA in surveillance techniques and other elements of what the CIA calls tradecraft, the how to do it, the nuts and bolts of espionage. When the D.C. police assumed this responsibility for the CIA in infiltrating and reporting to the CIA on the activities of D.C.-based radical organizations, there was one bit of irony that was involved. One of the D.C. police informants that was taking part in this program came under suspicion that perhaps she was some sort of a double agent or she was engaged in some sort of conduct that the department feared. The woman has not been named in any public source, but most observers here in Washington feel that person was a woman named Ann Callego. And Ann Callego infiltrated virtually every major radical organization in the D.C. area that was working on anti-war activities on a national organizational perspective. And her cover was that of being a little bit mentally unbalanced. Her nickname was Crazy Annie. And so Crazy Annie hung out with Rennie Davis, and she hung out with the New Mode people, and she hung out with the Mayday people and whatnot, and was fairly well placed. And as far as we can tell, she was the highest placed D.C. police agent within the anti-war movement. However, it was either Anne or some other female informant who incurred the ire of some D.C. police intelligence officers, or incurred their suspicion. And the CIA, who the women were indirectly reporting to through the Washington, D.C. Police Department, became the targets of CIA surveillance. And a number of CIA personnel physically engaged in surveillance of the woman for a number of weeks until her situation was resolved. Evidently, they found that she was not in a position to compromise the police, and the surveillance was dropped. These are just two examples of what 65 agencies are up to. I hope that gives you a general overview of what kind of domestic activities we've seen. The agency, I think, that is the most ripe right now for investigation is Drug Enforcement. There is a major scandal that is brewing within DEA over blackmail and potential murder of suspected drug dealers by DEA agents. That report is somewhere in the mill over at the Justice Department. It hasn't been released yet. But when it is released, I think it's going to create quite a furor, and it's going to give also some new light for people to consider the recent shooting of Scott Camille, who's a former leader of Vietnam Veterans Against the War and was shot in the back by Drug Enforcement agents while he was riding in a car with two unidentified DEA agents back in April. Camille claims that he was shot because he was at the time writing a book on drug enforcement and corruption in Florida. And the drug agents claim they shot him when he resisted arrest during a cocaine deal. But if we are to believe people such as former BNDD agent Pat Sanders and others who have been on the inside and have cause to know, I think that it's not impossible that Drug Enforcement Agency and perhaps other federal agencies have been involved in outright murder in the course of their domestic intelligence operations.
During the FBI's campaign against the Black Panther Party, the Air Force was also working to get Panthers out of their ranks, and I was wondering if there were any connection between the two.
Well, there's always been communication between the Air Force Office of Special Investigation and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I know this is a matter of first-hand knowledge since I was in the Air Force, and in the course of getting my files from the military under the Freedom of Information Act, one document that was turned over to me by the Air Force Office of Special Investigation was an FBI rap sheet on me. It was simply listing an arrest that had been made. I was arrested for drunken disorderly in Florida shortly before I went to Vietnam, and it turned up in my Air Force OSI file as a report from the FBI. So if a small petty thing such as drunken disorderly turns up as a matter of FBI record in Air Force files, then things that are of major security concerns to the FBI, such as membership in the Black Panther Party, is going to be obviously sent over to the FBI, or over to Air Force OSI. You know, there was that communication. I'm sure that there was some sort of effort made to ferret Black Panther members out of not only the Air Force, but also the Army and the Marine Corps and the Navy. It's a matter of, the intelligence community has what they call a community of interest that comes out of their common purpose. And when it came to the Black Panther Party, that common interest, that community of interest, was an overriding security concern. And there was much communication between the military and civil authorities on party members within the armed forces. And the need to get them out was based very much on the fact that the Panthers were inside the military, were learning how to use military techniques and military hardware.
And were they successful in removing Panthers from among them?
Well, I'm sure that there were some Panther members that were forced out of the military. I think that, Some Panthers even welcomed it, since they didn't want to be a part of a force that might be called into the streets of Chicago or wherever to gun their own people down. I think that the military, by its very nature, is a self-defeating force that radicalizes more people than they care to admit, and that in the process of throwing Panthers out, they expose many, many more people, both blacks and whites, to radical ideology and concerns.
Concerning the CIA's Operation Chaos, you said that approximately 28 agents were involved in that.
It was 23 to be exact.
Okay. On January 15th of this year, CIA Director Colby testified before the Senate Appropriations Committee that there were less than a dozen agents. I was wondering if you could explain the contradiction there.
Well, the contradiction is page 138 of the Rockefeller Report, where the Rockefeller Commission says that between 70 and 74, a total of 23 agents were recruited for the project. I have the book open now, and they say of which 11 completed the prescribed development process in the United States. That is, 11 of the 23 were actually sent overseas. Now, what happened to the remaining dozen, we don't know. We also don't know that 23 is really the number. You know, it could have been many more.
As far as the legality of such an operation, in the Rockefeller Commission report, they quote CIA Director at the time, Richard Helms, in a memo of December 5th, 1972, and it says that Helms said, "Chaos is a legitimate counterintelligence function of the agency and cannot be stopped simply because some members of the organization do not like this activity."
Well, that shows how deep the concern within the liberal ranks of the CIA went on this, or how far back it went. I think that it also shows that if Helms was really believed that chaos was what it was designed to do, he could potentially cover himself in any event of a leak or a flap, because when you read Chaos, it does talk about the recruitment and training of agents for foreign operations. So if you stretch definitions a little bit, tug at the seams, yes, Chaos was a program whose primary focus on paper, or philosophically, was a foreign intelligence purpose. But what happened in the process, and it was the inexorable result of the clandestine mentality and this community of interest that I talked about earlier, was that people simply didn't hang out around coffee houses and learn leftist jargon, but they involved themselves in politics. They began to file reports on domestic political activities, and Chaos at that point no longer became a foreign intelligence operation, but became a domestic intelligence operation, for all that Mr. Helms cares to admit it or not. Chaos did violate the law. I think Mr. Helms is probably criminally culpable for some of the activities that occurred under Chaos, and he's got a lot of questions that he isn't really answering these days, and I think that part of that has to do with the fact that Mr. Helms is deeply in fear of an indictment at this point.
That Operation Chaos has officially been terminated, but do you think agencies like the CIA have really stopped their domestic activities?
I think that the CIA has ceased its domestic activities on the level that it was at during the period of 70 through 74. I have no doubts at all that there are Americans who still work for the CIA overseas under some sort of radical cover that would only be a logical technique or tool that they would use. But I think that the CIA has been split enough by internal dissension and by the revelations that started with Watergate and expanded through the last 3 summers that they would be very, very foolish people if they continued to spy upon the American political process the way they have in the past. The FBI is another question. The FBI continues its operations at the same strength as they always have been. The FBI has managed to come out of this whole crisis the most untainted of the intelligence agencies. They're starting to complain a little bit about sources slacking off on them, and the possible disaster that would develop if all their techniques and their sources were forced into public. But Clarence Kelly has been been very adept at taking an agency that was split by the actions of L. Patrick Gray and the death of J. Edgar Hoover, and molding it into some sort of cohesive force that has managed to effect a very, very strong outer wall to protect itself. What goes on inside that wall with the continuing politics of, inner-house squabbles is something that we still don't know. We know there are different factions between the Hoover supporters, the Gray supporters, and the Kelly supporters that exist right down to this very moment. But all those people have agreed on a certain point of unity, and that is that the FBI should not come out of this period with its name dirtied or its techniques and sources revealed.
What about the information that's collected during operations like these? In the case of Chaos, the CIA says that it's just going to hold that data until the investigations are over. But do you think the information will be destroyed, or will it just be moved to another place?
Well, the Army claims it destroyed its file. It had hundreds of thousands of names and files on domestic political activity. And they were ordered to destroy those files by Defense Department officials, and they reported to the committees of Congress that the files were destroyed. And then earlier this year, NBC reporter Ford Rowan broke a major story where he revealed that in fact those files had been reduced to a different computer form and had been sent to the National Security Agency headquarters at Fort George Meade, Maryland. I don't trust them to destroy those files. I think that they could make all sorts of claims that the files were destroyed and still have them in some sort of retrieval system. There are 8,000 separate data banks within the federal government, and there's always room for one more somewhere under some sort of cover.
Do you think it's necessary that they destroy these files, seeing as how, any damage in collecting the information has already been done?
I basically feel it's a moot point because I think that what's needed is to abolish the agencies and not the files. I can't think of any legitimate purpose for allowing the CIA to continue at this point. What foreign intelligence operations it might conduct in terms of, what is called legitimate intelligence collection can be done by the State Department or some other agency. But as long as we have a foreign intelligence organization that has both its collection arm and its operational arm under one roof, we're going to have abuses and more domestic spying. The leaders of the CIA throughout its entire history have come out of the operational side. They're former OSS men who have illusions of grandeur about the days when they parachuted behind Nazi lines to conduct liaison work and sabotage work with European resistance forces. But now we find that far from parachuting behind the Nazi lines in 1975, these men are the Nazis. And, the only thing that we can do is push for the abolition of their agencies.
Some people who would disagree with you would make the point that we need a CIA because the Russians have a KGB. What do you answer to that?
Oh, well, as I said, there are some legitimate concerns about the collection of intelligence. The KGB, until recent years, has not been involved in the covert operations that the CIA has been involved in. And I think that any covert operations that came out of the KGB came out of, as Nixon would call it, protective reaction to CIA activities. I think that there's always been some sort of understanding between the U.S. and the Soviets about intelligence operations. There was a shooting war at one point between the CIA and the KGB that resulted in the deaths of agents in Europe on both sides. And those sort of hostilities have been reduced to the point where when the CIA sends certain area specialists to Moscow, for example, under diplomatic cover, they tell the KGB in advance, look, we got a guy coming over for area familiarization, he'll be there for a year, and then he's coming back here, and don't worry about him, he's not going to do anything in terms of, espionage while he's there, he's just going to sit back and read the Moscow newspapers for a year. And they, in turn, to a certain extent, do the same thing with us. I'm not saying this is a widespread practice, but at least on certain levels there's that communication between the KGB and the CIA. and they consider it a gentlemanly thing to do. It's part of the code of honor among spies or whatever. So I don't think that the KGB is anything that we really have to worry about or hold up as an excuse to keep the CIA going the way it is today. Covert operations is what it boils down to. Do we need a covert enforcement arm for the executive branch of government that is responsible to no one, including the executive branch, as we've seen with this brouhaha over the toxins? You know, the president ordered the CIA to destroy poisonous toxins, and they didn't. The CIA is supposed to be responsible to the president, et cetera, et cetera. So who does the CIA really take orders from? They take orders from no one except themselves. And that comes out of this leadership that the CIA has traditionally had from the covert operations side, and reforming the CIA will not rid it of that mentality. The only way the U.S. government is going to free itself of the kind of behavior that we've seen come to light in the last 2.5 years is by totally abolishing the CIA, transferring those legitimate functions of state that concern themselves with intelligence to the Department of State, and hoping that the world will forgive us for our sins.
Getting back to domestic surveillance, does the U.S. government, do they really have a need for spying on U.S. citizens, and what is the result of that spying?
Well, as long as there's been political movements, there have been spies. And I think that, you know, it's just that historical precedent that has created what the government considers to be the need. I guess the strongest argument that I've ever heard towards the ineffectiveness and the uselessness of domestic spying, in terms of infiltration at least, came from a former military intelligence captain who testified before Sam Ervin's Constitutional Rights Subcommittee in early 1973. And he told Ervin that, you know, he'd been involved in the military intelligence spying and supervised nets of agents operating in the United States that had infiltrated domestic political organizations. And from the information provided by those agents, he compiled and prepared intelligence estimates on what to expect in the area of civil disturbances. After he left the Army, he no longer had those resources, but he simply subscribed to a number of radical publications. And just by reading the overt propaganda from the left, the overt publications, the mass publications, he was able to put together, compile, and prepare a similar analysis on the potential for civil disturbances that was just as accurate as anything he had prepared during his days in Army intelligence. And I think that right there makes the argument that the spying is a waste of money. It has a very chilling effect upon people's rights towards political association, free speech, all of our basic democratic and guaranteed freedoms. So I have real problems with people that shout out, well, you know, the communists are doing this and the communists are doing that, and we need to protect ourselves, because the method that the government has chosen to protect itself is one that really rubs against the grain of any sort of democratic process or democratic theory. I'm for the abolition of domestic spying. I think that I've seen my own FBI file, or at least portions of it, and they turned over a total of only 7 documents to me, and I've been a political activist only for 5 years. And in those 7 documents, they covered only 4 of those 5 years, and they had many more that they denied me, 151 other files or documents that were not turned over to me. But in those 7 of 158, they had 65 separate incidents in my life, and there was an error rate of 10% in it. 10% of the information in that FBI file was erroneous, blatantly erroneous, to the point of even placing me in cities where I wasn't at the time alleged incidents occurred. Their reason for doing this was that they thought I was involved in sedition and conspiracy and all these other sorts of violations of laws that have been traditionally used against radicals. So, the information they collect through infiltration is useless to